Good morning. Welcome to the Resolution Foundation. My name is David Willits, President of the Foundation. This is actually our first public event since the departure of Torsten Bell. So I'd just like to say how all of us at RES appreciate the fantastic contribution he made over almost 9 years here and wish him well for the future. Today we are looking at the fiscal scene and state crafting. We've had a lot of focus on individual policy commitments during the election campaign already and exactly how much individual commitments might cost. Today we're taking a step back and looking at the overall fiscal scene, and we will start with hearing from Cara Pacitti, who is our senior economist here at Resolution, and then we'll have expert commentary from Nikki Morgan and Gemma Tetlow. But first, Cara, over to you.
Great. Great, thanks, David. And before I start, I'd also like to thank the other authors on this paper, James Smith and Charlie McCurdy, as well as the Nuffield Foundation for generously funding our pre-election programme of work. So given the difficult outlook for the public finances, and partly because of the central role that fiscal policy tends to play in the UK's political discourse anyway, we'll hear a lot about the public finances over the election period. This report looks a bit about how we've got here and also what the future might hold for the public finances. So I'm going to start with some backward-looking context. So looking firstly at the size of the state, government spending has shrunk and then expanded again since 2010, leaving us broadly back where we started. Total government spending, so that blue line there on this chart, fell as a proportion of GDP from 46.5% in 2009-10 to 39.5% in 2018-19, the equivalent of £1,500 per household in today's money. But the combination of increases at the 2019 spending round, followed by increases in spending over the pandemic and the cost of living crisis, mean that the size of the state today has returned to not far off the pre-austerity peak. While the overall size of the state hasn't changed a huge amount since 2010, the shape of the state and how the government is spending has changed dramatically. As you can see here, over the 2010s, departmental funding was cut very sharply. That's the red and the dark blue bars on the sort of left of this chart. With significant cuts to welfare spending, which fell by 1/5 between 2009-10 and 2019-20. Since 2019-20, we've seen a policy choice to partially reverse some of those departmental spending cuts, with spending review in 2019 announcing the largest increase in departmental spending since 2002. But what we've also seen is very large and unexpected rises in other spending as a result of 2 consecutive crises we've been through. So this chart currently shows on the right the March 2020 plans for spending between 2019-20 and 2024-25. And here are the current forecasts. So you can see that those planned increases in departmental spending, again, the red and the dark blue bars appeared, and those actually happened. But there's also these really large and unexpected increases in both welfare and debt interest spending as a result of ending up in a higher inflation and higher interest rate world than we expected. As you can see in terms of borrowing on this chart here, the deep cuts to spending, so between the sort of far left dark blue bar and the middle dark blue bar, we saw over the 2010s, left borrowing 7.6 percentage points of GDP lower by 2019-20. Since then, we've seen the higher spending that I mentioned, those red bars on the right, but also much higher taxes. As you can see, partly through a combination of high inflation and frozen tax thresholds, public sector tax receipts have risen by around 4 percentage points of GDP, that red bar on the right, offsetting most but not all of the spending increases we've seen over this period. We'll be launching more analysis later this week, looking at how taxes have changed over this period. So all of this, plus some other financial transactions, has left public sector net debt much higher, rising by 15 percentage points over the Parliament, the second highest rise over a Parliament since World War II after the financial crisis. So that blue bar at the bottom there. And we've also seen the largest rise in general government net debt out of the G7 over this period. So this is a tricky inheritance, and whoever wins the next election will have to contend with public services that have seen steep cuts in the past, taxes that have already been rising, as well as a large debt stock. But an incoming government will also be looking ahead to the Parliament yet to come. So what will they be facing over the medium term? So far, there's been a huge amount of political debate, as we might have seen sort of last night as well as throughout this campaign, on a focus on specific costings of various policy announcements by both parties. So as you can see, a lot of back and forth going on there. Both parties have generally attempted to fully cost their pledges so far, but for both parties, there appears to be policies that are likely to include some further borrowing. And obviously these policy announcements are an important signal of the ambitions of each party in terms of the shape of the state going forwards and how much they're prioritising tax versus spend. However, in general, the scale of policy announcements here is much smaller than both what we've seen in previous elections, as well as much smaller, crucially, compared to the wider risks to the fiscal outlook, which is what I'm going to turn to now. Currently, debt is forecast to remain almost flat over the medium term. Both parties have stated they'd like to see debt falling over the medium term, and that's currently met by a very slim margin of £9 billion. There is, however, considerable uncertainty around this outlook, as well as additional costs that have become clearer since the OBR's last forecast. Interest rate volatility could provide a future government with positive news for the public finances, with every percentage point decrease in interest rate expectations removing £12 billion from borrowing. But they could also move in the opposite direction, as they have since the OBR's recent forecast, adding around £2 billion to borrowing over the next 3 years. Another much larger source of uncertainty is the OBR's currently very optimistic forecast for productivity growth. In their forecast, the OBR have been assuming for a while much higher productivity growth than both the Bank of England and that experienced in the UK post-financial crisis. And you can see here the post-financial crisis average is the sort of the solid red line at the bottom of that swathe, and the OBR's forecast, the dotted line in the middle there. The OBR's own modelling showed that a half percentage point downgrade to this assumption could add over £40 billion to borrowing by the end of the forecast. But even a more modest downgrade, so just half the gap between the current forecast and the 2013-2019 average for productivity growth, would add £17 billion to borrowing by the end of the forecast. Finally, costs relating to the compensation of those affected by the infected blood scandal have become clearer since the OBR's March forecast and have been estimated to amount to around £10 billion. So taking together this news on compensation payments, changes to interest rates, even just a modest downgrade to the OBR's productivity assumption, would leave a future government missing their aim to have debt falling by £12 billion, which would obviously be even larger if we saw, for example, a larger productivity downgrade. On top of all of this, current forecasts include spending assumptions that would see cuts to unprotected government departments in real per capita terms of £19 billion. These cuts for departments from justice to local government will be extremely challenging to deliver given the current pressures on public services. For example, on this chart you can see the share of crime victims not satisfied with the police has risen from 3 in 10 in 2010 to 4 in 10 today, while dissatisfaction with the performance of local councils has risen by over a third over the last decade. Obviously, in contrast to the forecast uncertainties I mentioned earlier, the government does have more agency over whether it delivers these spending cuts, but they do look extremely challenging. If real per capita spending cuts are not delivered, and further top-ups to budgets such as the Home Office are continued, this would leave a black hole in the public finances of over £30 billion, so the light blue line on this chart. The real debate then will be how to manage these larger fiscal pressures, rather than a focus on the much smaller spending commitments being currently discussed by both parties. Taxes often rise after an election, and an incoming government may choose to reprioritise existing spending plans to meet these fiscal pressures. There are also some other options that have been mentioned as part of the wider fiscal debates, including by the Treasury Select Committee and the IFS, including tweaking the fiscal rules to target total debt, which would realise about £16 billion of extra fiscal headroom in 2028-29, or asking the Bank of England to move to a system that would reduce spending on debt interest by up to £8 billion by the end of the forecast. These options are not without risks, however, and I think the main takeaway is that there are no real easy decisions here. To summarise, much of the election debate has focused on controversial policy costings, rather than the much larger risks that already exist for the fiscal outlook, which, depending on how far bad news actually crystallises, could leave the next government facing a £30 billion black hole in the public finances and some difficult choices about how to move forward. And on that slightly ominous note, I'm going to leave you there.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Clara, handing over the challenge to our distinguished panellists. I should have said, by the way, that for our online participants, if you go to our Slido page, do put in your questions for our discussion. Now we're going to hear from our two panelists, Nikki Morgan, who was a member of Parliament and in that time was both Secretary of State for Education, Financial Secretary of the Treasury, and also Chair of the Treasury Committee. Since then, Nikki has wisely, like me, retreated to the safety of the House of Lords and now is an active member of the Lords and also is on the board of Santander. Nikki, over to you for your observations.
Well, good morning, everybody. David, thank you very much. And Cara, thank you for a fascinating report. So I had a few thoughts when I was reading it and look forward to, obviously, the discussions. And I suspect we're going to have more of a discussion here this morning on the state of the public finances than we're probably going to get in the next 29 days. And I have to say, looking at that, I did the Laura Krinsberg show 10 days ago, and Rachel Reeves was the prime guest, and she was asked whether she was looking forward to being the first female chancellor. I don't want to prejudge the outcome of the election, but should she become our first female chancellor, I have to say it's quite a sobering set of handover notes that she's going to be given. So there's a lot going on. I think the first point in the report, I think there is a point about the campaign, and what's really welcome about this report is that standing back and looking at the bigger picture. So sadly, I don't think we're going to see much of that on the campaign trail. I think there will be a continued thing about some smallish spending commitments and an emphasis all the time on the fact that they are properly funded. Although, as we saw in last night's debate, which I think both Gemma and I have confessed already we didn't watch, there was lots of sort of allegations of things that are unfunded. So there's a debate around aspirations and whether they're funded or not. But I think what we're seeing in terms of specific commitments, yes, they're funded partly because I think the politicians are aware of the backdrop that you have set out, Cara. I was also struck in the report, rightly, by your commentary on the public mood, if I could put it like that. And that ties in, obviously, in terms of what potential spending cuts departments might be. You outlined some things, particularly in relation to health spending, for example. But obviously, there's been huge pressure on schools budgets, which has been a cause close to my heart for a number of years. But I also think about things like prison places, where we saw the government having to roll out a sort of emergency programme just before the election of not putting people in prison or allowing people on bail, for example, not to be put in prison or kept in police cells. I'm struck by, and I don't know, David, you were active in politics in 2010 as well. Standing on the doorsteps in 2010, when I knocked on the doors of people who are public sector workers, they would say to me, I can absolutely see where money can be saved where I work. I can see where money is being unwisely spent. And I do not think that you would have that conversation today if you knocked on the door of somebody who worked in, the NHS, education, police, prison services. And it's the same actually again in 1997, where again people felt, no, actually, hang on, we would like to see more spending on the areas that we care about. So in a way that makes the political backdrop to all of this even more complicated. And I think I'm also struck by your point about the shape of the state having changed, which I think is absolutely fascinating, what's happened in terms of cuts to public spending, then growth, obviously fuelled in many ways by the pandemic and the essential spending that. And I think, it's one of those things that people do recognise. You have to remind people often when you're campaigning about what happened in the pandemic in terms of support, both for businesses and for individuals. People are incredibly grateful. And I personally think if I were the Prime Minister, I'd be making a lot more of that decision, actually, because a lot of people for whom otherwise their businesses and their whole livelihoods would have gone to the wall in the pandemic very, very quickly. But I think what that does is it makes it very difficult then to have, and I think to have that debate, and I think there's a frankly, are the public prepared, what you have set out quite rightly in your paper, are the public prepared to hear about the tough choices? I'm just not sure, and it will take a very skilled set of politicians and ministers after the election to guide people through the choices that are going to have to be made. I was fascinated. So I think the question is, has the shape of the economy, not just here but overseas, changed? Are we expecting to return to a higher rate of growth? I was at a dinner last night with a very eminent economist speaking, and they were saying that actually maybe we're just not going to go back to, in the Western world, those high levels of growth that we have seen in the past. If we don't, what does that do? Things like the importance of the role of AI, increased productivity. And I was really struck by your charts, page 27, of the UK's debt stock not being particularly large compared to other G7 economies. And I hadn't seen it quite laid out in that way before, and that comparison. So the point you made, and this is one I'm sure that the future Treasury Select Committee will want to look at, is about the interest paid on the national debt and the whole cost of the unwinding of QE. And I couldn't find it in here this morning, but I was very struck when reading the comment about how much we are paying on our debt interest compared to the Department for Education budget. And when you put it like that to people and you say, this is what we're paying in interest, no wonder everyone in Westminster is watching what happens to interest rates, and the Bank of England knows just how much scrutiny they are under. For what it's worth, I don't think we'll see any changes in June because of the election, so we'll have to wait until August. Having said all that, actually what's fascinating is what's happening or not happening to inflation. And Chris Giles from the FT had a very interesting newsletter on that yesterday, not just here, but things like services inflation as well. I think the final point I wanted to make were 2 points. One was, and I think Gemma we might touch on this as well, the whole issue about parliamentary scrutiny. Obviously, having chaired the Treasury Select Committee, whoever takes that over, and if we have a change of government, we will have a change of chair, because traditionally the TSC chair it goes with who the party is in government. And what is their role in scrutinising a future government's spending plans, what they're going to do to the public debt, for example, and does the Treasury Select Committee have the capabilities? And I was talking to somebody before the election about whether we should have a sort of parliamentary budget office in the way they do, I think, in the sort of US Congress. I think the role of the OBR will be obviously of critical importance. But I think, again, we might come on talk about the need for a multi-year spending review. Again, fascinating in terms of timing, but speaking as somebody who, amongst other interests, I'm on the board of the Science Museum, for example, and the cultural sector would say that actually, if you're living from year to year, you just can't plan. And actually, if you do want to potentially make changes to public spending, at least having multi-year settlements enables departments to sort of think ahead a little bit more on that. The one thing is I'm fascinated by the last two suggestions in relation to the Bank of England debt and tiered reserves. You can expect, I suspect, to hear a lot more commentary from the City of London, certainly on the latter. I thought the Bank of England governor recently, who just said, we don't have minimum reserves. That was all he felt he needed to say at that stage in his speech. But I think that one is rumbling around, and how that ties in with the competitiveness agenda would be fascinating. So lots there to chew on. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Nikki. And of course, you're absolutely right, and you're right about the changing shape of the state, which we bring out. And if you look at it, the growth areas are National Health Service, which is particularly mainly a service for older people, though of course there are other, all age groups are cared for, and the growth of spending on pensions with the triple lock. So it's a reshaping of the state towards a particular generation, which some of us are very concerned about. Let's now hear from Gemma Tetlow, who was at the Institute for Fiscal Studies, was at the Financial Times, now Chief Economist at the Institute for Government. Thank you very much for joining us. Over to you, Gemma.
Thank you, David. I also thought this was a really excellent report, as ever, from the Resolution Foundation. And I think you're totally right in your overall framing, as Nikki said, that the really big question on the fiscal side is not the debates we're going to have during the election campaign about is this specific promise funded or is it not, but actually underlying all of the main parties' plans are some tax and spending assumptions that are pretty implausible given what we know is coming down the road. So on that, on the tax side, I guess you didn't spell out in your presentation, but both of the main parties are assuming that fuel duty, for example, is going to go up by 5p next April and then rise in line with inflation. Is that going to happen? Seems hard to believe on the basis of the last decade and more of experience. If it doesn't, that's a further hole in the tax plans that needs to be filled from somewhere else. To be honest, even if it does happen, fuel duty eventually, as we shift to electric vehicles, is going to go away. So there's still a problem lurking there that needs to be tackled as well. On the public services side, I mean, you've set this out somewhat already, but I thought I'd add some sort of facts to the debate from our performance tracker work at the Institute for Government, just to give a sense of what the problems already are in public services. And as Cara already laid out, the assumptions in the numbers at the moment assume that you need to make really quite large real terms cuts to the areas that haven't been explicitly protected. So the NHS has got pledges of more money, for childcare, overseas aid and defence, but for other areas, and particularly for criminal justice services, on the current plans, they're facing really quite big cuts and they're already struggling. I mean, Nikki talked about prisons already, but I would say prisons are really already at crisis point. They are extraordinarily full. There hasn't been the investment needed to even maintain, let alone expand the prison estate to in line with rising prisoner numbers, and the expected growth in the prison estate over the next few years is not going to keep pace with growth. I think it's one of those issues that is not terribly electorally salient. I don't think many politicians expect to win votes on the basis of improving the quality of prisons, but there is a point at which it becomes a sufficient crisis, and we're perhaps starting to see that when police are having to be told don't prosecute any more people because we can't fit them into prisons. I think it kind of is at that point now. There's also a record backlog in courts. There are 78% more cases waiting to be heard in the Crown courts than there were before the pandemic. Although we've actually got a record number of police officers now, the number of crimes being charged hasn't increased, so something is not quite working there as well. In adult social care, obviously local governments have had their budgets squeezed quite a lot over the last, since the financial crisis. So you see things like the number of people receiving adult social care funded by the state has actually fallen, even though obviously the number of people requesting care has gone up quite a bit. And in the NHS, perhaps that's where we've seen a lot of publicity, but most of the key targets for the NHS on A&E waiting times, cancer treatment and elective treatment waiting times, those haven't been met since early 2016, and we've just been steadily getting further and further away from those targets. So there really is a very difficult picture of pressures across pretty much all major public services that the next government is going to have to deal with. And so a real question about how you do that. I think one thing that may be more of an issue in the next Parliament that hasn't been such a topic of discussion in the past, we've tended to focus very much on the day-to-day spending on services. How much are we paying for our nurses and our doctors and our teachers? I think increasingly the question of what are the capital assets that those services are working with, so the buildings they've got, the IT, the other equipment and technology that they're working with, is becoming increasingly clear as a problem. So looking at the NHS, although we've got 20% more doctors and nurses now than we had pre-pandemic, actually activity is pretty much flatlined, and one of the issues going on there seems to be that hospitals' ceilings are falling in, so we can't use operating theatres, lifts are out of order, the IT is incredibly antiquated, we don't have very many diagnostic pieces of equipment compared to other similar countries. So I think one question facing the next government is going to be having to think much more carefully about what's the right balance between, yes, we want more day-to-day spending to do the activity, but actually also what's the right balance to ensuring that those people are working with the right equipment in the right conditions to actually make the most of their skills. Definitely major problems for many services. The next government is going to face very difficult choices about how to address this. As Cara laid out, we're already set to have tax rising to a historically high level. So I don't think there is a simple answer here of just tax more and spend more to solve all these problems. I think there's a genuine question about what the right balance here is, and a real need to make sure we're getting the most out of every pound of public money that we're spending. I think there probably are ways you could try to do that. Nikki's already alluded to some of them around providing greater long-term certainty so that services and infrastructure providers and the like can make plans and spend that money more effectively than perhaps they have in the past. But we can probably go in discussions to think about more of the opportunities that aren't just about spending more money. But as Nikki and David and Cara have said, I doubt this is going to form much of the basis of the substance of discussion over the next few weeks, but hopefully it will be a really key part of the government's focus when it comes in, is actually figuring out how to make all of these difficult choices add up together.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Gemma. And let's just stick with that really tough fiscal position that you've been outlining and we've all been talking about. And I think in some ways the most dramatic figure in Cara's excellent report is that if you just lower the productivity growth assumption, which is currently 1.1% in the OBR forecast, higher than Britain's recent record and higher than other forecasts, if you just split the difference and with 0.7, which is what many other people expect, and make it 0.9% productivity improvement per year, then you get a £17 billion hit on the public finances by the end of the next Parliament, which is significantly greater than the fiscal headroom that Jeremy Hunt has been operating with. So just in terms of understanding the current position, imagine that you are the head of the OBR offering a briefing perhaps to an incoming Labour Chancellor and have to explain to this new Chancellor why you enable Jeremy Hunt to operate with a 1.1% assumption, but as you start preparing your first set of forecasts for a new Labour government, you've brought that down, and it's now going to be, say, 0.9. At the same time as the Chancellor's rhetoric is going to be how they're going to boost growth and boost productivity. That is quite a tricky first meeting. And as Cara was previously at the OBR, I'm going to exempt her from answering this question. But I'm interested to hear from Gemma and Nikki just how you see that going and how fiscally it ties in with a wider question. I think we've had one in our Q&A. There's one I'm going to call up. Yes, there's this is just how big the problems facing the public finances are. Is the government simply going to face such severe fiscal constraints that it will not be able to do anything about struggling public services and weak growth? Gemma, what's your advice?
So firstly, I don't know that the OBR is going to downgrade its assumption. So
No,
this is just assuming, let's take a world where they think that is the right thing to do. It's extraordinarily unfortunate timing, as you say. But I think if the OBR thinks that is the right change to make, then it would be much better for them to make it now at the start of the Parliament before the government starts to set its plans in motion and do its prioritisations, because then it can work on the basis of that outlook rather than not doing it now and 6 months later saying, oh, actually, sorry guys, you thought you had that, but you don't any longer. I think if I were the OBR and trying to explain that and have that conversation with the government, the most important thing would be to be very clear about what it is that's driving that change. I think that it is difficult because those figures are inherently a degree of judgment based on various indicators. I mean, the OBR has sort of been in this world of assuming we don't get back to pre-financial crisis rates of growth, but we do a bit better than the very sluggish performance we've had for the last decade or more. And you're trying to figure out where in that range you are. So it's incredibly difficult, but if I were them, I would be trying to go into that meeting with as much evidence and explanation as possible to say why this is the case and why the last 6 months basically have showed me that actually this is the right assumption that I didn't make in March.
Thank you. Nikki?
I agree with that. I think if I were a new incoming set of ministers, I would say to the OBR, actually I think you'll probably find a more receptive audience than you might expect, in the sense that you might as well have all the bad news at the start and actually really know what you are dealing with. And I think Gemma's completely right. The next question is, well, why the downgrade? What has changed potentially since the figures that you gave the government in March? And is there something that in those figures that something can be done about, or is there something that is perhaps global or some external factor that is driving that lower productivity? And then, I mean, there are going to be some difficult choices. I do think that the spending review, what happens in the autumn, taking some time to think about these things is important. If I were a new set of ministers, I think to attempt to answer the question here, no, I think that a future government will be able to do something about public services, but there will be choices. But I think if you can do things on a multi-year basis you can also ask those departments, having been in a spending department, it's much easier if you are given a multi-year option, because then you can plan, or if you are going to do things differently, then you can start to, whether it's perhaps bringing in outside private investors, for example, in terms of big capital infrastructure projects. But that takes time. You can't do it in the space of 12 months. So in terms of weak growth, I think probably there has to be, whether the Treasury have it or can commission it, some really good analysis. I'd say if we are in an environment in the West of just weaker growth generally, better to know about it.
Yep.
And be honest about it. And what is it? And I think the NHS recent conversation about productivity, I'm mindful of the NHS director I heard being interviewed, said this, I think this is the 5th such report I've read. Well, they've got to act on it now.
Yeah.
So not all is not lost, but it will be tricky.
By the way, Ashley, explain what worries me about this kind of question from Anonymous is we assume at Resolution Foundation that Anonymous are by and large Treasury officials. So everybody's worried. Cara, I don't know if there's any comments you want to make on the wider question.
No, I think it is a sort of case of you don't really want a new government coming in and being totally nihilistic and saying, well, we're in a tough space in terms of public finances. There's just nothing to be done. But I think it's important to realise that there are tough decisions over whether you tax more, given taxes already sort of at near record highs, whether you try and reprioritise spending given the pressures we've talked about, or whether you make tweaks to your fiscal framework. But even that comes with risks, given that if you are loosening your fiscal policy and you are borrowing more, then there are always kind of risks associated with that in terms of kind of higher debt interest costs further down the line, or even kind of market reactions if you're doing something really big in terms of fiscal loosening. So yeah, I think definitely tough decisions, but I think also important not to kind of go too far the other way and be totally nihilistic and say, well, there's no money for anything, we can't do anything.
Yes, very wise, very wise. And in fact, I'm just going to call up a poll now, and we'll give people time to answer it, but which does, our first question, which does kind of address this. What could change in the economic outlook? And let's face it, there's potentially good news as well as bad news. So I'd be interested for any participants, people here in the room if they're online, and also our online people, if what you might think about the prospects of these potential changes in the economic outlook. Some, of course, fiscally benign, others not so. And while we wait for that answer to come in, I'm just going to see if there's anybody here physically with us today who would like to ask a question of our panel before I go back online. Yes, we have our roving mic heading your way, sir. Over to you.
Piers Williamson, I wonder what your view was on the state of local authorities in all of this. So we've got some in kind of special measures, and I get the sense we've got quite a lot limping along. They're all howling about the cost of temporary housing and so on at the minute. How are we going to get through? How are they going to get through the next 5 years?
Yes, and that actually chimes in with an anonymous question we've had, which is absolutely about the state of the local government finances as well. Nikki, do you want to comment on that?
Well, so what's interesting is, as you say, there's a real variation in local authorities. I think you're right, everybody is under pressure, every local authority. Some have taken swifter action. They could see it coming. Some have still got reserves, and others have decided to do things differently, or make earlier decisions about doing less, for example. I think one of the interesting things about the next government, whoever it might be, is what happens in terms of devolution, and what impact that has on the local authority landscape. I think also, one of the issues that we're not going to hear about in this election campaign, although others are talking about it, is around the funding of social care. And I don't think you can have a conversation. I don't think the next government can have a conversation about NHS spending without also talking about social care. And one of the big things, in my experience, is trying to get the NHS and local authorities to properly not just talk to each other, but work together on this. And you would have thought by now that actually, given the funding constraints and squeeze, they might have stopped being in their silos and started properly talking to each other. And those areas that have done that, I think, have found that they are able to make a difference and stop worrying about who's responsible and everything, and actually really think about the patient at the heart of it and how do you keep people out of hospital. Yeah. But there's a lot more to be done on that. Obviously, in terms of my old brief of education, one of the reasons why actually we wanted there to be more academy schools, for example, directly funded by the DfE, is then local authorities are not having to fund educational authorities in quite the same way. And I don't know if there's any analysis, but I'd be really interested to know about whether those local authorities where they're not having to spend so much on education directly, whether there is a difference in their sort of funding and fiscal health, if you like, to those who've decided they want to carry on funding and be responsible for schools.
Yeah. Cara, do you want to comment on this local government finance question? And of course, there's an observation in your paper on local government finance and social care costs.
Yeah, definitely. I wanted to also just pick up quickly on the point you made about housing. So I think it's a really interesting point in terms of sort of thinking a bit about false economies as well, where the government's maybe tried to save money, but it hasn't quite kind of worked out. And actually ends up sort of costing more down the line. Because we have seen sort of freezes over the past few years in local housing allowance and the sort of money that's paid out through the welfare system to support low-income groups with their housing costs. And that saves central government money, but what we have seen is sort of rises in temporary accommodation and costs that local government has to cover because of those kind of freezes. So you do sort of see those costs just appearing elsewhere, and local government have been kind of bearing the brunt of a lot of those in the housing world as a result of some of those freezes we've seen in benefit support as well.
Yeah, and we do say in terms of local government pressure, of course, if you were to offer a fair pay deal to workers in social care, which is an admirable thing to do, and Labour are committed to, then that has itself a public expenditure cost pressure, which has to be balanced out, and it's another example of how tricky all this is. Gemma, your observations?
Yeah, just a couple of things to add to that. I mean, one, local government grants from central government have been cut significantly. So I think they're cut by 40% between 2009 and 2019 in real terms. But one side effect of that is that local government's funding mix is now much more reliant on the tax revenues from council tax and business rates than it is from central government grant, which has the sort of positive benefit that actually now their overall budgets will be growing somewhat more quickly because those tax revenues are rising even if central government continues to cut grants more steeply. But that does mean that there's therefore more variation across areas in terms of the richness of their tax base. So areas that have more revenue raising capacity are more able to benefit from that tax growth and more able to use the flexibilities in things like additional social care precepts and things like that on top of that. So it's become an increasingly mixed picture. I totally agree with Nikki's point about trying to learn from what works across the country, because there are definitely pockets of things working better, including on health and care services working more closely together. I think one real opportunity, particularly as we pushed further down the devolution agenda, is to make use of that, have areas trialling things and then actually properly learn from that and share best practice where we can.
Thank you very much. Now let's just go back to the answer to the poll we did earlier, just see where we are on the whether we think the changes are going to be helpful or unhelpful. Let's have a look at the result. If we do get the result. No. Tension is almost unbearable.
I want to know what the answer is. Yeah.
we all want to know what the answer is.
Interesting. Okay.
And it's a very interesting balance because, of course, lower interest rates helps, would be as we identify in the paper, but higher borrowing, further higher borrowing. Okay, well, there is the wisdom of crowds in front of us. There we are. That's what could happen. One helpful, one unhelpful. Let's take another question from people physically participating. Okay, let's go over there first. Yep. James is doing the London Marathon. Thank you, James.
Your exercise.
Get your steps in.
Hi, David Robinson, Market News. Just following up, and it's partly on David Willett's comment earlier, is the OBR actually the right organisation to forecast productivity? And I think there, because if you think it's got a small staff, 3 people on the Budget Responsibility Committee, at least one of whom has said on the record there is not a lot of science behind their productivity estimate. Gemma's point, they went halfway towards pre-GFC levels. Yeah, you've got a much bigger staff at the Bank of England. And the Bank of England itself has problems, which is a lot of its brightest and best have all defected into academia and hedge funds. The National Institute has a pretty sophisticated view. Not clear why, say, the OBR would have a better view than the National Institute. Yeah? And yet all this political pressure is now on the OBR. Is there a different way of doing it? You know, whether you do it as a kind of committee judgment, you average out, you include the Great and Good England Resolution Foundation, I don't know. But is there a way of doing it? It doesn't mean it comes down to the judgment, essentially, of 3 people at the OBR with a small support staff.
Yes, it's interesting, and I might turn to Gemma at the moment. Cara is free to opt whether you wish to join in on this or not. We did have the head of the OBR sitting here back in March, and he's been here several times, when the question about the OBR's productivity assumptions being rather more optimistic than general has been put to him. And what Richard, I hope this isn't unfair, but Richard, I think, he made it clear that he regarded David Miles, who is as a wise advisor on all this. But he was not didactic. He wasn't saying that we have superior wisdom. And the Bank of England themselves, who I was asking about this recently, the bank themselves appear to be relatively unfocused on productivity, because in their model, it doesn't particularly have an influence on inflation, so is not so relevant to their monetary policy decisions. So we may have ended up with a rather important element of the forecasting that neither organisation particularly has intellectual strength in. But Gemma, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, so I think for various reasons, including that the OBR, they own the whole economic and fiscal forecast, and there are important interactions between what you assume on productivity and the rest of the elements of your forecast. So I do think, I think I would stick with a world where they are making the judgment that goes in, and that they stand up and defend and under that judgment. I think they should be making best use of all the available evidence out there. I mean, they do talk to NISA, for example, about their modelling and their evidence. So I would hope, if they're not already, that they use, I think they probably are, but I would hope they use all the best quality evidence out there and are talking to people. On the margins, would it help them to have more people who can spend more time looking at this? I'm sure they would very much welcome that. On the Bank of England question, I totally agree with David's point that for the Bank of England's forecasting, actually thinking about long-term productivity, medium to long-term productivity growth, which really matters for the fiscal outlook, is not an important thing for the Bank of England. So they're really doing a 3-year forecast where that's sort of an implicit element, but it's not a huge aspect of it. So I think they're not necessarily, don't necessarily just want to lift and plonk what's in theirs. If it were me, I think we have an odd allocation of resources between a huge wealth of people working on monetary policy in the UK and very few people working on important economic analysis related to fiscal policy. It's for strange historical reasons, but it is quite a noticeable imbalance of resources there. So I would probably have a slightly different balance if I was starting from scratch on that.
Thank you, Gemma. Very interesting. Cara, do you want to comment on that?
I guess the only other aspect we've not really touched on is the sort of other aspects of sort of political pressure, or the sort of additional pressure that we've seen kind of over previous forecasts, is where there's been kind of policies announced that are supposed to have an impact on growth, how and if the OBR kind of scores that growth, and how much kind of they assume that those policies increase the sort of potential growth of the economy. And that's another sort of issue which I think there's been quite a lot of focus on, is kind of how much pressure that puts on those individual judgments, and whether a politician can then say, I've announced this policy and actually it's going to pay for itself or partly offset its costs as a result of that growth. So I think that's the kind of other aspect of this. There's sort of the sort of baseline forecast, there's a lot of pressure on that, and then there's also additionally the kind of this other issue of how far you then kind of allow how far you cost kind of improvements in growth based on policies.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and you're right. We've basically seen over the last year and a half or so the OBR giving more credit for policies having a supply side impact. I think there are positives and negatives of that. I've definitely heard from people within government that it's prompted a different mindset in coming up with policies, that they're now thinking more about, is this policy going to have a growth impact, and will the OBR score that, which I think is positive. That should be part of the thinking when you're developing policies, and it sounds like that wasn't as much a feature as it has become. So that's great. But I also think Cara is right to be concerned about the danger that the OBR comes under huge pressure to score these things, and that you end up with far too much time and effort being spent trying to game the OBR's forecasting process rather than just coming up with good policies.
Yeah. And Nikki, your observations on all this?
I think that last point is fascinating, actually, and I hope that people aren't spending lots of time trying to game OBR forwards. I think if you didn't have the OBR, you have to have somebody. I think we're now, and I think we've had the experiment where you announce a huge change in fiscal policy, if you like, without the OBR giving its blessing. We know what happened there, so let's not do that again. I think that potentially in Westminster sometimes the OBR is held up as a sort of, it's got all the answers, everyone sort of goes straight to it, and of course economics is a lot more fluid than that. I think your idea potentially of having some kind of, whether it's a panel, being clear about the workings, who's had the input, where the numbers have come from, would be welcome. And Gemma's point about potentially rebalancing resources rather than just the focus on monetary policy. But I think we are now in a situation, as I say, where you have to have, whether it's that 3-letter acronym or someone else, someone's got to do that job, and it is essential. Yeah.
I'm going to take another question. I think the gentleman here in the front row was keen to ask questions. So over to you next.
Thanks, James. I wanted to, sorry, Daniel Pettit. I wanted to go back to the point on like hard choices. In my mind, I think the public might find tax rises a little more palatable if you articulate clearly like what it's going towards. And I'd welcome your views on that, particularly in the context of the fact that we've had kind of 2 consequent budgets that have lowered tax, but we've also had a stealth tax rise through the freezing of thresholds. So in theory, a smart way to do it might be to raise the thresholds, but like you can kind of mask that as maybe not being a tax rise in the same light as you would like through a NIX or an income tax raise. But do we not think the public are a little more like aware that actually we need a bit more money to be spent on important services? We've just mentioned local governments, which are under huge pressure. So I'd welcome just a little more reflection on that.
Thank you for that. And I'm actually, we've got a question online. It's absolutely about this question. So let's jump directly into the question whether there is a scope for further taxes. Nikki, do you want to comment on that? You face the political realities of this. What's your view?
I like the line in the middle of this one. Is it based on specifically British reluctance to tax? The middle class to squeeze, who could we tax more? I'm not sure that we are politically, from conversation with voters, at a stage where people are saying it is different from 1997, where people were saying we should be paying a bit more tax for public service. I think that because of the cost of living squeeze, because yes, energy bills have come down, but they're still high, and even with wages still running, well, actually probably now slightly above inflation, people are still finding it in many ways difficult to make ends meet. So I think that it would be it's not impossible to potentially find something to change. And I think the other thing is the Treasury hate hypothecation. So even if a minister arrives with a brilliant scheme to we're going to raise this to fund this, they just can't stand it as a precedent, in my experience. So your point about thresholds is well made. I think that might come back round being an issue in this campaign. the difficulty, I mean, I think, is that for many members of the public, the threshold thing is sort of slightly lost in the mists of. You're absolutely right to say that obviously threshold's not having changed. It has pulled more people in. It has raised more money. That's good news if you're the Chancellor. I think lots of people don't understand that, and so even if you were to change it, I'm not sure that the politicians will get the credit for doing that. So you're right. You want to go to a simple tax change, and then there isn't the headroom to do it. I'm just not sure that the political mood is quite there at the moment on the doorsteps.
And I think one reason for the inhibitions you see at the moment amongst campaigning politicians is the 27 election experience of Theresa May,
Yes,
where
exactly,
trying
yeah.
to level with people on how you fund social care proved to be politically disastrous during the campaign. I should also say that, of course, there was then legislated through the increase in NI specifically for social care, the social care levy, where the political battle had been fought, and the legislation was going through. And then Liz Truss said she would repeal that, and she then fell, and Rishi arrived, and the legislation to reverse the levy was in the Lords. And I can remember a conversation in the House of Lords with several people saying, "Are we absolutely sure we want to reverse this levy now? We've had the Prime Minister who had decided to do it has just fallen. Would it be a public service for the Lords to reject this and to keep the levy in place, because it might come in handy in future?" And there was a general view that would go way beyond the powers of the non-elected. But I actually think, remember, we had gone through the political battle for a social care levy, which was then removed from the statute book by a government that only lasted just over 40 days. So we've had two different ways, frustrating examples of how hard this can be. Gemma, I don't know if you want to comment.
I agree with your basic point that I think if governments do want to raise taxes or do something major in the tax system, then building a case around that this is a package of things that will overall deliver something that you like, would be helpful to try and get away from the losers problem with tax rises and tax changes. I think there was some polling from Ipsos from around the time of the budget that suggested there was a fairly even split between a group of people who say, I would like more spending on public services, even if that means me paying more tax, and the group who say, I would be happy with lower public spending if it meant tax cuts for me. So I think Nikki's right that the public aren't completely here yet. I mean, I wonder, and I've not seen anything on this, but as Cara laid out, we have actually seen a big increase in public spending in recent years. So I wonder if there's a question in some voters' minds about where did the money go? Why am I not seeing that? And so if I'm giving you more money, is it really going to deliver benefits? Yeah.
Cara?
I think it was interesting you mentioned a bit about kind of thresholds and sort of stealth taxing. Because I think that's something, it's a big change you've sort of seen in recent years. A lot of this sort of rise in tax we've seen as a result of the government choosing to freeze tax thresholds. And then because we've seen massive inflation, people getting pulled over those thresholds into higher tax bands or into paying tax the first time. And that is something I think previously has been seen as sort of a very stealthy, kind of low-key way to raise tax. It's a lot less noticeable than doing big kind of changes to headline rates. But actually, given the scale of what we've seen, I think it probably is something that people have kind of noticed a bit more. I think when you've got sort of tens of billions of pounds worth of higher tax as a result of those threshold freezes, can you really call it a stealth tax anymore? So I think we have seen a bit of a shift in that over kind of recent years as well. It's been a sort of feature of what we've seen.
Yeah. Now, let's, in the last 20 minutes or so, think particularly about what the options are for an incoming government. We've got a polling question inviting you to consider what they might do. And there we are.
I like the optimism of the first one.
Yes. It's all going to happen. The world is just going to get better, so we're all right. That's a wonderful sentiment. And while we just see how people respond to that, there's a gentleman here I know has been keen to ask a question, so we'll take your questions then while people reflect on the answer to that poll.
Yeah, thanks. I just wonder, are there lessons we can learn from the US about what changes, supply side changes we need to make to increase our productivity? Because for many years we're told, America's doing much better than we are, and and productivity growth is the foundations for higher living standards. What policy recommendations would you come up with?
Yes.
Or is our economy just so different from America that we'll never
Right.
get there? But
Yeah. And again, I must say it's fascinating, these interventions here from our physical participants. There's an online question that I'm calling up very similarly, just looking at how I think the Biden administration doesn't seem to face anything like these fiscal constraints. So, Cara, do you want to just reflect on that? How are there some unique British problems here?
Yeah, I'd push back slightly on this. Is this all Liz Truss's fault? I think it's probably fair to say at this point that high interest rates are more a result of kind of sticky inflation than the sort of risk premium that we saw that over the end of the Liz Truss period. I think on the wider question of are we sort of facing specific UK issues compared to global ones? I mean, there are obviously kind of big global pressures, like countries across the world have just come through these two crises we're sort of facing more sort of geopolitical shocks, facing challenges of reaching net zero. These are not specifically kind of UK problems. I think it probably is fair to say the UK does have its own problems. Particularly, we've been underinvesting over previous decades relative to kind of other advanced economies. We know that if you want kind of productivity growth to increase, then sort of investment, business investment, public investment is a really big part of that. And that's somewhere where the UK has performed particularly poorly compared to its peers. And we've done a lot of work previously looking at kind of what a strategy for the UK might look like, and it probably is kind of focusing on the UK's relative advantages in terms of sort of services industries, and thinking about how you kind of boost those, and probably focusing on kind of the UK's second cities and other things like that. So I think there are sort of global issues that all advanced economies are facing, but the UK has a legacy of underinvestment that needs to address, and probably does need to be thinking about what does a UK specific growth strategy look like.
Yeah, thank you. Nikki?
I think it's a really good question, actually, and I was just I'm not an expert on the US economy, and but I was just trying to think, whether there are things that they do as a nation that we don't. I've no idea whether their planning system is as crazy and unhelpful as ours, but I suspect it probably isn't. I think they probably have a very different attitude towards business risk and sort of support for business startups, and we know, for example, that they've got deeper capital markets, and companies are still wanting to go raise capital there, and that's sort of easier perhaps over there. I think also really interesting your point, Cara, about second cities. I mean, I just think it is a more we are so concentrated on London and the southeast in this country, and I think one of the great regrets that we haven't seen take off over the last couple of years is giving much more of a sort of oomph to levelling up, which was completely the right thing to do. I don't care what the next government calls it. I just want them to do it. So I think there's sort of things like that I'm sure that we can learn. It is a different economy, but I also think, that go back to my point about that chart about the different the debt across different G7 economies. The US deficit is larger than ours, and I think that's really interesting when we are constantly sort of agonising here about the sort of size of our debt.
Thank you. Gemma?
I don't, yeah.
Right. Now, let's move. I'm going to move on actually to a line of questioning that is very popular amongst our online participants. We've had two questions basically about, there's an obvious tax option, which is some kind of tax on assets. This question from John Bryant has been upvoted a lot, and there's a kind of similar question from Ed, may or not be Ed Miliband, we don't know. So let's think about capital taxes. And I don't, and we have done some thinking about this here at Res. Cara, do you want to set the ball rolling?
Yeah, I know. We are publishing later in the week. I'll look at the tax tax changes we've had kind of in recent years. So I'll maybe leave some of that to kind of future work that's coming soon. But I think this is a question. We've seen kind of wealth in the UK rise kind of significantly over previous decades, but wealth taxation remained relatively flat. And it is true that kind of types of income are taxed very differently in the UK. So like employment income is taxed kind of much more highly than, say, sort of income from capital gains. So I think it's kind of perhaps unsurprising that that is where people go to, where they look at where is there kind of the potential to tax more. It would be sort of thinking about aligning kind of taxes on different types of income.
Mm-hmm. And of course, it was Nigel Lawson who promulgated the doctrine that rates of capital taxation should match income tax and introduced a 40% rate of CGT. And it was Gordon Brown as Chancellor who appealed to the VC community by reversing that. So there are a range of options. Nikki, what do you think about capital taxes?
Well, I think, and the previous question on similar lines was about, sort of why not? I think we shouldn't underestimate the sort of emotional impact of taxation. So I'm not sure how much work has been done on that, but what does our taxation system say about how we think people should acquire wealth, I suppose is one way of putting it. And we have traditionally wanted to incentivise, recognise in this country, certainly centre-right governments, the acquisition of housing, the acquisition of making investments, gathering savings, for example, and we've decided that actually taxing income or employment, and of course what that does is it takes out those who are not working from paying taxes, and we so far in this country have made the decision that we think that's the right thing to do. And I think it would be again, it's not impossible, but it would be quite a big change to move to taxing capital. It's a bit like, well, we have this thing about inheritance tax, which I say I never quite understand, given the sort of small number of people ultimately affected. But we are in this country very wedded to enabling people to gather assets as they go through life and then potentially leave them to the next generation. And that will be quite an emotional shift. Maybe we should do it in the sense of, ageing population, differing outlook, but it would be a really, really big shift, let alone what it would raise, but also your point, David, about the message it would send to people investing as well, which is going back to the point about wanting more investment, for example.
And I think it's true to say that whenever we've looked at this at resolution, we've also recognised the Treasury argument that there isn't a sort of doomsday book register of everyone's wealth. So a wealth tax, in the sense of trying to understand the value of everything from your diamond ring to property you may own abroad, is very hard. But the Treasury view has always been operationally it's easiest to tax people when something happens, when you enjoy a capital gain. And although stamp duty brings its own drawbacks, they tend to find it easily operational to do that kind of thing, rather than a single mega wealth tax. But Gemma, any observations that you've got?
Yes, a few things. I think there are quite a lot of distortions in our tax system from the different treatment of different sources of income, which is particularly problematic when people can effectively relabel their activities as being one thing and not another, which wastes a lot of people's time and effort in doing that relabeling rather than just doing some economic activity. So I think there is scope for thinking seriously about, is there a good reason for treating these things differently from one another? I guess that goes to another question, which is there are lots of claimed benefits of the various reliefs and special treatments that we have in our tax system, incentivising investment in different types of firms and the like. And there's often not great evidence on whether that's actually achieving what it's supposed to. And part of the reason for that is that our tax policy making processes have far fewer checks and balances in them than our spending policy development processes do. If government wants to spend money, it has to go through a rigorous policy development process, send a business case to the Treasury, who will go through it with a fine-tooth comb and challenge all of the assumptions in it. If we want to make a tax policy change, so we give a tax relief to someone, that could be dreamed up in a matter of weeks in the run-up to a budget and goes in to the budget without the same kind of checks and balances. And we don't always do a great job of systematically evaluating tax policies either. So I think there is a real question. There may be very good reasons for having special treatment for things in the tax system, but let's look at whether they actually work and whether that's an efficient way of achieving what we think we're doing. On the sort of wealth tax question, I think it's worth distinguishing between whether we're talking about taxing flows of benefits or stocks of benefits. I think those two things are quite different, and particularly when thinking about inheritance tax, inheritance tax is doing two things. One is taxing taxing transfers between generations, and some people view that as being inappropriate, that that's your money, you've already paid tax, you should be allowed to leave it. Other people take a different view. But it's also acting as a backstop against things that haven't already been taxed, whether that's capital gains on primary residences, or you don't pay capital gains tax at death. So part of inheritance tax is just taxing those accumulations of capital gains that would normally be taxed if you realise them in life. So I think we need to be very careful about thinking, what are we taxing? And even some of those stock taxes, if we were to get rid of them or change them, we need to make sure that we were actually filling in the gaps in the rest of the system before doing that. And there's lots of allowances in inheritance tax, which again, I think we should look seriously at whether things like agricultural property relief and business relief in inheritance tax are actually doing what we think they're doing.
Yes, very interesting. Thank you, Gemma. So we've covered the sort of the tax angle. There's another line of questioning about the borrowing and fiscal rules. Is that another way of trying to get out of this constraint? And here we've got a question. Really, you could argue, just go back to classic formulation, that you run a balanced current budget, but you're allowed to borrow for capital. Gemma, is this one opportunity, one way of greater flexibility in fiscal rules, or do you have your personal shopping list of other flexibilities you would bring in?
We published a report on the fiscal framework earlier this year, and I think the place we came down was that there are definitely benefits to having fiscal rules in place to help guide those necessary trade-offs within government. I think there has been a lot of talk about whether we should tweak the details of fiscal rules to allow more space to do investment in the things we like. I really worry from past history that tweaking the details of the rules just increases the obsessive focus on how you can game the letter of the rules, rather than actually thinking about the spirit of those rules, which is fundamentally that we want to ensure fiscal sustainability for the country, and we have some rules that try and summarise that objective in a sort of day-to-day working framework. So personally, I think if the next government thinks we need to do more investment in things that are growth enhancing and good for the UK in the long run, I would rather see a government stand up and make that case and say why it is necessary to be running slightly higher borrowing in the short term to do that and what you expect the benefits to be, rather than changing your fiscal rules to try and create some alleged headroom that allows you to do that. And I think the financial markets, given all of the changes in fiscal rules that have been over recent years, talking to people, I don't think they worry so much about the precise detail. They are increasingly looking more broadly at what are the government's fiscal plans, are they credible, and what do we think about that. So I think the sort of Liz Truss experience was more that the whole impression of that government was that they were not wedded any longer to worrying about fiscal sustainability, rather than that they were breaching any particular rule.
Now, there is the voice of common sense. We have got, however, in our report, two fantastically geeky possible changes to the fiscal rules. We don't advocate them, but we do have two ingenious proposals. I don't know, Cara, if you want to comment on them or anything else.
Yeah, one
on
of those
rules?
is something that has, I think, been discussed as a kind of tweak to the fiscal rules. The future government, might choose to make if they were looking to increase headroom. I think, as Gemma was saying, it's worth saying that any kind of change or tweak to the fiscal rules isn't actually kind of manufacturing extra fiscal sustainability out of nowhere. You are just choosing to borrow more. You are choosing to loosen fiscal policy, and that does obviously come with risks. But I guess the change that I think has been discussed around sort of Treasury Select Committee reports is whether or not you continue to have a target that excludes the Bank of England's balance sheet from debt. The reason that tends to matter is because at the moment the government is making very large transfers to the Bank of England to cover losses related to quantitative easing. At the moment, excluding the Bank of England, essentially there's a lot of accounting things going on, but essentially what's happening is you're kind of sending money, and because you're not including the Bank of England's balance sheet as part of your wider balance sheet, you're not seeing the money arriving. So what you see in your debt profile is that those big transfers kind of going out the door, as it were. So if you move back to including the Bank of England's balance sheet, then you no longer are recording those kind of transfers at the point they're happening, even though you are kind of recording the wider risk related to quantitative easing at kind of other points in the debt profile. So it's a sort of techie accounting sort of change there that is sort of relatively small but would increase headroom, at least temporarily. But it's also, we're seeing that's quite temporary because the Bank of England's obviously unwinding its quantitative easing programme. So as that unwinds over time, the benefits of moving back to public sector net debt target decreases over time.
Yeah, so eliminating the effect of transactions between the Treasury and the Bank of England would be one possible option. Nikki, what do you think? Would you think that, how would you, if you were coming with all your experience being in the Treasury and Treasury Committee, would you change the fiscal rules?
I think if the fiscal rules are out of date, because the shape of the economy has changed and the need for, we decide that actually we're happier with a higher level of public debt and everything else, then again, it would be a brave set of ministers, but actually would you not be better off just actually saying we're going to do this, have a review properly, we're going to spend time thinking about it, and potentially we are going to update the rules. And that's partly because, and I think Gemma's right, which is, again, we had the Liz Truss experiment, so if you're going to make these changes, you need to do them in a calm, rational way, not spook the markets. But I do think that if our economies are permanently changing, the state is permanently changing shape, as you've sort of set out in, not permanently, but you set out the changing nature of it, then is it not better to do that? And partly because I think the other thing is that when I've been involved in budget events, and when something doesn't quite hit the numbers expected or everything else, the whole commentariat rush off and latch onto a number, and actually there may be a very good reason why that number's not being hit or it's been changed or whatever, and better to have that debate and that conversation. I think so I note that the suggestions in the report, as I say, the first one, interestingly to say, Cara, it's not permanent. So but I never was. By the time QE was being unwound, I wasn't chairing the committee anymore. But we said at the time when it was all happening, QE, actually, how are you going to unwind it to the Bank of England? What's the impact going to be? And I think the second one, as I say, about the minimum reserves, I think there is an issue about what that sends to the markets and how that ties in with the competitiveness agenda as well. So there are no easy answers. Is the honest truth.
Said the director of the Santander board. Yes, we mustn't be very careful about any suggestion.
Don't spook the markets. I think is hopefully a good lesson for all of us to remember.
Yeah, quite right. Now we're getting to the last few minutes. I'm just going to see what our poll result is for what our participants think about how the government will deal with its difficult fiscal inheritance. And there's a view there is it's the borrowing rule that you get rid of the debt rule. You could move to obviously some other fiscal focus on current versus capital or whatever. So I'm just now give our panellists a final opportunity to make your comments, and you may brief. And I'm going to start with Gemma because it also, I think, be interesting to know how Gemma, especially with your background now at the Institute for Government, thinks this process will now play out. When there was an assumption that we were having an autumn election and there'd be a kind of rollover of public spending plans for 1 year and then a public spending review taking time through into the summer of 2025. Now that may have changed. There'll be some kind of autumn budget. When might it be? Will there be a scope for any kind of quick review of public spending? What do you think the process might be now, Gemma?
Sure. So autumn budget. So if we got a change of government and Rachel Reeves was Chancellor, she has said that she would give the OBR the full 10 weeks to produce a new forecast. So I think my calculation was that you could just about squeeze that in before party conference season kicks off, but it would be pretty tight. I think you've got about a week before that happens if she set them off on day one. Public spending, I think, is the more interesting question. So you probably want to make some sort of big fiscal changes to know what the envelope is for public spending. As you said, on public spending, so at the moment we've only got detailed spending plans that run to the end of March next year. The government has a kind of hard deadline of needing to give local authorities an answer by December on what their budgets are going to be so that they can meet their obligations to set out their budgets for the next year. So the government has to make an announcement on 2025-26 spending plans by December. You're right, David, that the summer election gives us an opportunity that you may have time to not only work out the one-year spending plans, but perhaps also work out your multi-year plans between July and December. We think that the government would actually still be better off doing a one-year settlement with perhaps some multi-year certainty for a few areas, perhaps a few high priority areas, perhaps some elements of capital spending where you want to provide some longer term certainty quickly. We would encourage a new government to still take another year to do a proper multi-year spending review for the rest of public spending, looking comprehensively across the piece, because of these challenges that we've outlined and the real need to figure out how to prioritise and how to allocate money most effectively. So we think taking that extra time would allow you to, for example, do some thematic reviews across different areas, perhaps taking housing as an example. What are all the various government policies that support housing? Is that the right mix? If we want to make improvements, where should we allocate the marginal extra money? Or thinking about how can we more effectively integrate health and social care to tackle some of those problems. So basically there's lots you could do to try and make sure you're spending the money better and making sure that, particularly if it is a new change of party, that public spending plans are actually aligning to their priorities rather than the last government's priorities, that we think would be very hard to do in merely a matter of months and using the old existing processes which haven't been a terribly comprehensive look at public spending and recent spending reviews.
And that would tie in with what the incoming Labour government did in '97, where there were some announcements of the New Deal and the windfall tax early on, and then they took a bit longer to do a fuller spending review.
Yeah.
And even actually in '79, when I was in the Treasury, there was a quick change in public spending plans and then a longer review as well. So you may find you did it that way around. Now, Nikki, with all your political experience, how do you think this fiscal debate is going to play out?
Well, I think that I take what Gemma's saying, and I think totally understand your logical and rational approach to it. You're right about time. Having said that, I think that the new Chancellor will have a succession of people, not just from the OBR, telling her potentially about what the numbers might look like, but actually a succession of local authority chief executives, people running all sorts of things, new secretaries of state who will suddenly be told, well, actually, we've got not enough money for school places, or not this or not that. Going to get in there and see the new chief secretary very, very quickly. And so I really hope it's not just a one-year spending settlement, because I don't think there's any hope of being able to get people to start thinking about how they might deal with the public spending challenges if it's just 1 year. But we'll have to see. But I do think that probably if you did a 2-year, then you could actually you buy yourself potentially a little bit of time to start. If you do want to think about the fiscal framework, or you do want to put in place, some more work around public sector productivity, which has got to be an element of increasing growth, for example, and you need time to do that. The final thing, I think, just from our discussion, I'm really struck by one of the points that I think has been made, and I think if we have got anonymous Treasury officials listening, I will say this, which is that I do think that the Treasury approach, so today is all about managing public finances. The Treasury approach to cost saving, I think it was you, Gemma, that said this about sometimes there's sort of initial push to save costs, or there's a sort of belief in the Treasury that departments is not spending well, so therefore we're not going to give them more money. But actually the longer term cost of that, I think we have to get much, much better at measuring that as a country. Yes, you may look like you've got a balanced budget when you announce it in November, but the long term cost of not supporting people with mental health issues, or not actually helping our kids to get back into sort of catching up on the education loss of the pandemic, actually it's something that I think we're going to be reaping for some time to come. So I think there is a shift needed in the Treasury orthodoxy on all of this as well.
Thank you very much, Nikki. Cara, last word to
I guess I'll do more on sort of economic side, whereas I guess the sort of buzzword is uncertainty. And I think it's what all economists have been saying for the past few years. There's still a huge amount of uncertainty, but I think anyone kind of coming into government is going to be really cognizant of that there are big downside risks that could crystallise here. Even though we will still have to wait to see where exactly interest rates kind of settle and where exactly all of the kind of labour market and sort of productivity and inflation data looks like later in the year. There are some very big downside risks, and if they crystallise, we are going to have a really big kind of fiscal challenge for the next government.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. Thank you to Cara. Thank you to our panellists. Thank you all for participating. It's been a really illuminating discussion. And I think, for me, the significance of the change in just that productivity assumption brings out Cara's point about the risks that we all face. But who knows, there might be an interest in the Treasury on productivity in public services and turning into a more positive agenda for improving productivity. But there are lots of uncertainties. Thank you all very much for joining us. Thank you very much indeed.